Again, here we are again. Thursday morning now. Thursday morning for me. Could be any time of day for you, or evening, I don't know, because I don't know when you're watching this. Time for another chapter of Slaves for the Isabella. It's been, I was going to say to you, had a really nice piece of news yesterday, which is that I've had my first inquiry for a virtual school visit. I've never done that before, but obviously authors are thinking about ways of doing this in the same way that musicians are thinking about how to perform to people that they can't reach. And yes, I've had an inquiry from a very small school up in County Durham, which I could never visit under normal circumstances because it would cost so much to get there, and it's so far I'd have to stay over, and I'd need them to cover those costs. I can't just foot the bill myself. And they wouldn't be able to afford it. So they couldn't do it. I couldn't go and see them. But I can do a Zoom visit. So that's coming up in November. So I'm very excited about that. It could be a whole new line of business. So chapter 6. Yeah, we've got to chapter 6 of Slaves for the Isabella. Joe is back in his own world. Lucy seemed to have sort of cottoned on to the fact that he wasn't like Josiah, but he hadn't told her he wasn't Josiah. And then Josiah turned up, and he looks exactly like Joe. Exactly like Joe, which is why everybody has made this mistake. But of course, Joe can't be there while Josiah's there, and that causes such a shock to his system that it sends him back to our world. Fortunately, he remembers to fling his St. Christopher towards Lucy. He still hasn't explained to her what it is, what it does, how it works, who he is, none of that. But as long as she has it, if she picks it up and thinks of him, or holds it and thinks of him, and he is thinking of her at the same time, that will pull him back. We know this from the other books. Okay, chapter 6. Oh yes, so he's in the middle of Bristol, standing beside the great bronze nail, gripping it so hard his fingers were as white as stone. Chapter 6. It's got 2-minute hands. The red one shows Greenwich Mean Time, and the black one... Joe? Are you all right? Dad caught hold of Joe's arm. You've got an awful colour. You're not going to pass out, are you? Joe leaned against his father, glad of his warmth and strength. He waited for the dizziness to stop. Are you okay? Fine, Joe croaked. I just came over a bit faint. Let's get you some breakfast, quick, Dad said. It's my fault for dawdling. Come on, we'll go back to the cafe you suggested. Joe let his father steer him back the way they'd come. The nausea wasn't too bad, but he was still dazed and disorientated by the suddenness of the time switch. By the time he'd finished his blueberry muffin, however, he was feeling better. When was the French Revolution, Dad? He asked. His father put his coffee cup down. One of the things I really like about you, he said, is that I never know what you're going to ask next. What made you think of that? Joe sipped his hot chocolate. I came across it in a book, he lied. I wondered what year it was. It was actually about 10 years, Dad said. People often think of it as 1789 because that was the start of it, with the storming of the Bastille in Paris. The other bit that people remember came later, when they started beheading people with the guillotine. King Louis XVI was the first in January 1793, and Queen Marie Antoinette was Queen Marie Antoinette was executed a few months later. The guillotine, Joe said. Is that the frame with the blade? Dad nodded. Huge numbers of people were sent to the guillotine in the latter part of the revolution. A lot of them hadn't done anything wrong, except for being rich. It was a bit unfair, really, he said, seeing Joe's frown. But Joe was trying to work out what year it had been in Lucy's world. Peter had mentioned the king fleeing, but not his execution, so it had to be before 1793, and it probably wasn't right at the start of the revolution, because Josiah's parents wouldn't have been worried enough to send him away. After all, they didn't know what was going to happen. Looking back across history, you could fall into the trap of thinking that things were inevitable, as though the events were all mapped out in advance. But that wasn't true. Nobody who lived through something knew how it was going to turn out. In any case, whether it was 1791 or a year either side probably didn't make a whole lot of difference. It wasn't like last time in London, where it had mattered precisely what date it was. "What was happening here in the 1790s?" he asked. "That would have been Georgian England," Dad said. "George III. Or did you mean here in Bristol?" "Here in Bristol, I suppose," Joe said, "if you know." "I don't know year for year," Dad said, "but Bristol was a major port through the 18th century, and at that time it was up to its neck in the slave trade." Joe's hot chocolate stopped halfway to his mouth. "Did they trade slaves here then?" Dad shook his head. No slave ship ever landed its human cargo in England, though plenty of people think they did. There are quite a few urban myths in Bristol to do with it. Black Boy Hill and the Black Boy Inn on White Ladies Road, for example. They're commonly thought to be related to the slave trade. But Black Boy was a popular name for lots of places after the black-haired Prince Charles II came back to the throne. So the pub and the road might have been named for him. And the White Ladies of White Ladies Road might have been medieval nuns in white habits, but they certainly weren't white-skinned ladies with African slaves. There's a rather persistent myth about the Redcliffe Caves, too, that slaves were chained up there. There's not a shred of truth in that one. The slaving ships sailed from Bristol to Africa with goods to trade, exchanged them for slaves, and sailed directly to the West Indies. That part of the journey, where the slaves were transported, was called the Middle Passage. When the ships came back to Bristol, they were carrying the sugar and tobacco produced by the slaves, but not the slaves themselves. The whole thing is called the triangular trade, because the route makes a triangle on the map. Dad paid the bill, and they got up to leave. "If slaves were never traded here, why do you say the city was up to its neck in it?" Joe felt decidedly uneasy. "Well, there are the obvious things. Street names like Jamaica Street and Guinea Street, for example. Guinea's what the English merchants called the bit of the African coast where the slavers kidnapped people, including children." They went down an alleyway beside the cafe and came out onto a much bigger road. "Then there are the streets named after successful slave traders," Dad went on, "such as Farr's Lane, Cave Street, Elton Street and Elton Road, and the various roads named after Tyndall. And of course there's Bristol's most infamous merchant, Edward Colston. He has all sorts named after him." "Who was he?" "He was a member of the Society of Merchant Venturers, who fought for slaving ships to be allowed to sail in and out of Bristol. He made a lot of money out of slaving, and most notably gave his name to Colston Hall, though not in his lifetime. People have been arguing for years about whether the hall should change its name, and it is going to now." "Why?" Joe asked. "What's the point?" Dad dug his hands into his pockets as they walked. "Partly, there are people who are really unhappy with the association. There have been bands and artists who refuse to play there, and some people won't go to events just because of the name." "It's just a name, though." "For some. But for others, giving Colston's name to a concert hall celebrates him when he doesn't deserve to be celebrated." "But if you change the name," Joe said, "isn't that like trying to cover over the past? Like pretending it didn't happen? Wouldn't it be better to leave it and just make sure that everyone knows what he did, so they don't think he's some kind of hero?" Dad nodded. "That's the other argument. The trouble is, it's hard to get the message across. People tend to automatically assume that a building has been named after someone who was generous or good. They're not going to stop for a lecture about where that person's money came from." The interesting thing about the Colston Hall debate is that it's done more than any education programme could ever have done to make sure people know about Colston. They turned off down the street to the left. "It probably is the right thing to do, to change the name," Dad went on. "But if we're going to avoid airbrushing our nation's past, then Britain needs to be taught about the way our forefathers behaved. Do you mean ordinary people in Bristol back then? Joe asked. They couldn't have been involved, could they, if the slaves weren't traded here? He knew that Lucy's family was much too wealthy to count as ordinary, but he was hoping for reassurance. Very few people would have seen it firsthand, Dad said. But that doesn't mean they weren't involved indirectly. Just think about it. First there's the shipping, so that's all the people who worked around the docks. Boat builders and chandlers, rope makers, sail makers, shipping agents, water bailiffs, the men who worked on the wharves. That's a lot of people. Not all ships were slave ships, of course, but at its peak a huge number of the port's comings and goings were connected with slavery in some way. Then there were all the people who made the goods that were shipped to Africa to exchange for slaves. Brass, copper, glass beads, cloth, even guns. And of course, somebody must have been manufacturing the chains and the manacles and the leg irons that were used on the Middle Passage. What are manacles? Joe asked, not sure he wanted to know. They're iron bands that were put round a person's wrists and chained together, like very heavy handcuffs, Dad said. And leg irons were the same thing, only for the ankles. Those poor people were kept chained up for most of the voyage, 2 or 3 months, in near darkness, on rough seas, in their own and everyone else's filth and sick. It must have been hell on earth. And think of the disease. It's no wonder that so many of them died on the crossing. Those who made it to the West Indies alive must have been in a terrible state. But back in this country, there were plenty of people happy to make money out of it. Joe looked at him, aghast. Meanwhile, out in the West Indies, Dad continued, the plantation owners needed supplies sent over. That's what I meant about other shipping connected with slavery. Clothes, food, building materials, furniture, it was all sent over, as well as all the tools for growing and harvesting the crops and the barrels for storing it. And at the other end of the route, there was what the plantations produced, to be shipped back to England. Molasses, rum, tobacco, and most importantly, sugar. You could say that sugar is what made Bristol great. A shiver ran down Joe's spine to hear Lucy's mother's words repeated in such a different way. But he wanted to stop Dad now, but Dad was just getting into his stride. There were lots of buildings called sugar houses around Bristol, he was saying, where the sugar was refined. That was a complicated process. It would have needed a lot of people to do the work, so all of them were indirectly involved in slavery. Then there were the merchants buying and selling the refined sugar, and because a lot of merchants and ship owners and plantation owners got rich from all this, there was a building boom. He gestured over his shoulder. We've just come past King Street, where the Theatre Royal is. That was built during the 18th century. And we're about to come to Queen Square, where some of the richest families in Bristol set up home. Dad was unknowingly echoing Lucy too. Joe stood beside him and looked at the gracious houses he'd seen with his friend from Brandon Hill. Not all the buildings are the original ones, Dad said, but the ones that have been replaced are the same style, so it probably feels pretty similar to how it was back then. Except that it's peaceful now, isn't it? Imagine the industry when it was being built. All those labourers from all the different trades. Joe thought of the new houses he had just seen with Lucy. Think of all the timbers and bricks being delivered and hoisted up, Dad said. And inside, the staircases and the chandeliers. You can see how every one of the workmen had a connection to slavery, even the lowliest errand boy on the building site, because the houses on this square, and a lot of other buildings around Bristol, were built with dirty money. Joe was silent. Was Lucy's house one of those? He had admired its elegance. He'd enjoyed her family's wealth. Yet in all probability it had been paid for with people's lives. Mind you, Dad said, as they walked along the side of the square, it wasn't just Bristol. The same money was pouring into London and Liverpool and Glasgow. All over the country, in fact, there are grand Georgian buildings still standing on their slaving foundations. Some of our institutions even, our banks and insurance companies, the railways. Some of our universities, even the Church of England, all of us benefit pretty much every day in some form or another. The people of this country owe a huge debt to the millions forced into slavery by our ancestors. They had reached the corner of the square and looked back for several long moments without speaking. Joe didn't know what to say. He didn't want to talk about this anymore, didn't want to think about it, especially what it might have to do with Lucy. It wasn't her fault what had happened any more than it was his, but that didn't make it okay. They left the square, crossed a wide road and went down a side street which came out beside the river. Plane trees had been planted along what must originally have been the quay. It was empty here now, just a short, misty stretch of water to saunter along. Joe tried to picture it as it had been in Lucy's time, the masts towering in the fog, the quayside crowded and busy. It was impossible. "There is one memorial to a slave rather than a slave owner," Dad said. "Over there." He pointed at the curved footbridge with two giant horns sticking up from it. "It's called Perrow's Bridge," he explained, "after a slave called Perrow. That wasn't his real name, of course, but it was the European name he was given when he was sold." "Why did they do that?" Joe asked, despite himself. It was another way of breaking a slave's spirit," Dad said, "as though the rest of it wasn't enough. If you kidnap a person and separate them from their children or parents, and from anyone else who speaks the same language, and you keep them in worse conditions than we would keep an animal, there's a good chance they'll lose the will to fight you. But just in case, you take away their name as well, to make them forget who they used to be." "What was Perrow's real name?" "We don't know. He was brought to England by a trader called John Pinney when he moved home from the West Indies. What's really sad is that Pinney never gave Perrow his freedom, so he died a slave. He was only about 40. Joe sighed. Was there nothing good to be said about anything? "What are those horn things on the bridge?" he asked. "Are they supposed to have a meaning?" Dad grinned. "No, they're just arty counterweights to balance the bridge when it lifts up to let the big boats through. Shall we go across and up Park Street towards John Pinney's house? It's a museum now. Or shall we leave that till later and go to the M shed?" Joe knew he did want to go to Park Street. He might find Lucy's house. But for now, he wanted a break from thinking about her world and its connections with slavery and sugar. "What's the M shed?" he asked. "It's a kind of museum of the city," Dad said. "It seems to have all sorts of things relating to Bristol. It looks really interesting." "Let's go there then," Joe agreed. It seemed a good way of putting off the things he didn't want to think about. But the M shed had an exhibition on slavery too. Joe hung back as Dad looked round. "You asked about manacles," he said. "There's a pair here, and some leg irons as well." Dad moved on, poring over the artefacts inside the glass cabinets. "Come and look at these account books from the plantations," he said. "This is fascinating." He leaned closer. "It lists the collars they used to punish slaves, alongside ladles and shutters. Just another ordinary item." He glanced across at Joe. "Those collars, they were made of iron, with long prongs sticking out so that the slave couldn't lie down comfortably. Sometimes they even had cowbells attached. Imagine the weight and the noise every time you moved so close to your head." Joe tried not to imagine it. "You'd have thought this plantation owner would have been ashamed to treat another human so cruelly," Dad said. "If I did something like that, I'd want to hide it. But the fact that the collars are on the list shows that it didn't strike anyone as unusual." He shook his head. "And look," he said, turning round, "this big white cone is sugar. It's called a sugar loaf. They used those things like pliers next to it to break bits off. They must have ended up with really jagged fragments of sugar for their tea, don't you think?" This was too much for Joe. He backed away. "I don't feel very well," he mumbled. "Can we go outside and get some fresh air?" Dad sprang forward. "Of course. Do you feel sick? There's a bench over there. Sit down. Put your head between your knees." "I want to go outside," Joe insisted. He did feel sick, but sitting with his head between his knees wouldn't get rid of the memory of Lucy's mother spooning shards of sugar into his teacup. And it wasn't just any old sugar either. It was sugar from Lucy's father's sugar house. Worse, it had probably been grown on her uncle's slave plantation. His friend was part of something really evil. Joe closed his eyes, trying to shut out the knowledge. Perhaps he could let this latest world go and hope to meet Lucy in another time, further on in history. Except that he'd given her his St. Christopher. He couldn't get to anywhere else in the past without it. What was more, sooner or later she'd be bound to call him back. The only way to prevent that was to stop thinking about her, and that would mean never seeing her again. His breath caught in his throat. He knew he couldn't forget her just like that. Outside the M-shed, he hung over the railing beside the river. His stomach swirled like the currents below him. There was nothing for it. He would have to let things take their course. And when she summoned him back, he would try and make her see what was wrong with her world. So there you have it. If you were wondering what the connection was, it's all laid out, isn't it? And it is startling, really startling. And every word of that true. I make very, very sure that I don't invent stuff I don't have to. So that is the impact that the slave trade had on a local level in Bristol, but also on a national level. It's immense. And of course, they talk about Colston. Now, when I wrote that book, the Colston Hall, as it was called, I'm not sure what it's called now, the big concert hall, was just about, it had just announced it was going to change its name, but didn't say what it was going to change its name to. And Colston had his face painted white, which I always really liked because, you know, the statue was made in black, which I also really liked. I felt that was sort of, I don't know, sort of ironic. And somebody had whitewashed his face. But I have to say, I personally was delighted to see him pulled down, and even more pleased to discover that they almost immediately, so he went in the river and then they fished him out, almost immediately they've put him into the M-shed with a display about who he was, I believe. I haven't seen it yet, I haven't been to Bristol since that happened. But the intention was to put him in the M-shed with a display about who he was and what he meant. And that is exactly what I wanted to see happen. And what I put into the mouths of my characters as a sort of suggestion. So, yeah, I was really pleased about that because we can't forget it, but we must know about it. And it is wrong to commemorate these people without a lot of information about who they really were. Because if you're going to commemorate somebody like that, then you need to say. So there we have it. Yeah, I don't know what you make of that. I hope you find it interesting. I hope it makes sense to you. If you have any questions, you can post them at the bottom of this video, either on YouTube or on Facebook, and I will answer them. And other than that, I hope to see you here tomorrow, 11:15 tomorrow morning for Chapter 7. Bye!